My name is Keenan Colquitt. I am the Program Manager for Diversity Scholar Engagement. I manage the Diversity Scholars Network, a scholarly community operating within the National Center for Institutional Diversity, NCID, at the University of Michigan. The Diversity Scholars Network is proud to present this two-part series, which explores how storytelling, counterstory, and embodied pedagogy disrupt white supremacy, patriarchy, and imperialism in academic spaces. To respond to the question, how can autoethnography serve as a practice of resistance in higher education? Today, we conclude our webinar series with a wonderful presentation entitled Autoethnography in the Classroom as a Site of Resistance. How can educators create inclusive, anti-oppressive learning environments? Today's event will begin with a presentation from Dr. Liz DeBetta. After her presentation, she and I will engage in a discussion about pedagogy, autoethnography, and once all of that's done, we will open things up to a discussion with all of you. But before all of this, a land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Three Fires Confederacy made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered ceremonially as a gift through the treaty at the foot of the rapids. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. And now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Liz DeBetta. Fantastic. Dr. Liz DeBetta is a scholar activist, founder of Migrating Towards Wholeness, a transformative program that empowers adoptees and women who have experienced trauma to heal and reclaim their narratives through creative writing and storytelling. As an adoptee herself, she brings a deeply personal perspective to her work, which emphasizes the power of personal narratives and fostering resistance and connection and self-acceptance. She holds a PhD in interdisciplinary studies with a focus on creative writing, feminist critical theory, social justice, and this all informs her innovative approach to blending art and activism. She is the author of Adult Adoptees and Writing to Heal, Migrating Towards Wholeness, and award-winning creator of her one-woman show, what is it, Unemothered?
Unmothered.
Unmothered. Well, that is because it's a UM-M-othered. I like that.
You'll see the graphic and it'll make sense in a few minutes.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, this one dives into her complexities of adoption and patriarchy, offering audiences a powerful explanation of identity and healing through performance. Her interdisciplinary approach combines creative expression, social justice, personal healing to inspire individual and collective transformation. In addition to her creative endeavors, she is an affiliated faculty member at the Institute for Research on Women and Gender and a part of the Diversity Scholars Network here at the University of Michigan. So, with all that being said, I'm really excited about this presentation, and I'll hand things over to you.
Thanks, Keenan. I'm really excited to be here with you all today, especially after yesterday's amazing presentation by my dear friend and colleague, Professor RAsheda Young, who is my co-conspirator in this world of autoethnography. So I'm really excited to follow up what she kicked off yesterday. As Keenan said, I'm Dr. Liz, and fun fact, I am a member of both Professional Actors Union, unions Actors Equity, and SAG-AFTRA. I got my undergraduate degree in theater. And then 25 years ago, I stepped into a New York City high school classroom kind of by accident. And I was fresh out of the theater world. And I discovered that teaching stories could change lives, including my own. And since then, in the subsequent years, I have my practice has beautifully evolved from teaching K to 12 and through college, and it's evolved beyond teaching K to 12 and in college classrooms into the work that I do now in community workshops, performance spaces, and now the Migrating Toward Wholeness framework that I have developed as part of my experience and exploration with autoethnography as what I call an authentic method. And at every point in my journey over the last 25 years, the same insight kept surfacing, that when people can author and not inherit their narratives, they migrate toward wholeness. And so autoethnography gave me the method by which to come to my belief that stories transform personal experience into political reality by revealing power inequalities and complex structures of emotion embedded in them. And that move from object to subject, which we're going to talk a lot about today, is what first powered my solo show Unmothered and has shaped my trauma-informed classrooms and workshops, where students and participants shift from silence to self-authorship, and their lives are transformed in the process. And so today I'm going to talk you through that evolution in what I will say are 3 acts, the first of which is embodied autoethnography. So I'll talk to you about how performing my adoptee narrative is what cracked open my decolonial research stance and my teaching as well. Second part is classroom as a site of resistance. And so how counterstory and pedagogy of tenderness disrupt white supremacist norms and can spark student agency and wholeness. And then the third part of it is I'll talk you through the migrating toward wholeness process wheel and how the data that I collected from my classroom has crystallized into this 5-part process that has the 7 parts of trauma healing embedded within it, and is really a roadmap for healing across emotional, cognitive, embodied, relational, and integrative dimensions of self. And so by the end, my hope is that you'll see how more stories equal more connection, and more connection equals more healing. And I hope that you'll also leave with some concrete practices to spark some migration in your own learning spaces and lives. And I'm going to share my screen now and get started. Okay, great. So again, we're here today to talk about autoethnography and the classroom as a site of resistance. And the guiding question that I want everyone to keep in mind today is how can we as educators turn classrooms into sites of resistance? And we're going to use the term classroom comprehensively, right? Because some of us may teach in higher ed, some of us may be teaching in K-12 spaces, some of us may be teaching in community spaces, some of us may be teaching in our homes. And so that's a blanket term for any of the spaces that we find ourselves teaching in, because for me, I'm always teaching. I don't think I've ever not been a teacher. And so this work is really a core part of who I am. And I can't separate myself from it to an extent. So I'm excited to have you all here as co-conspirators in this journey and to share a little bit of my insight with you. So one of the things that I had to struggle with myself, it was locating my voice. And this is true for most of us with histories of trauma, most people that have intersections of identity that are marginalized in some way. And I put that in quotes because I don't love that term, but it's a useful term in terms of understanding those of us who are on the outside of dominant culture. And adoption and adoptees are very much a marginalized part of the population in the sense that we live our lives with a narrative that is handed to us, as opposed to being able to tell our own stories about our own lives. And so the act of locating my voice through autoethnography and personal storytelling was a powerful shift for me, because it helped me to move away from some of the language that had been imposed upon me that had made me believe certain things about myself and my existence that weren't necessarily true. And ultimately that, this concept of moving from object to subject is really important here, because in society, lots of the dominant narratives want us to believe that adoption is a win-win, it's a rainbows and unicorn situation, and that adopted people should be grateful that they have a better life, that it doesn't matter where we came from. But what this actually is erasure and silencing. And so it becomes really difficult over time to break those silences and to feel like a full, whole person. And so I like to show this set of memes because they're an example of one of the things that I did when I taught writing for social change, which was to have students bring in, to have students work with a part of their identity that maybe had been hidden, or maybe was something that they hadn't considered was an important part of their experience, to explore the way that culture viewed that part of their identity. And I used myself as the example. And so these memes become the example. And we all know memes and frames, and they're powerful ways of framing narratives. And we can use them to shift culture when we understand the power that these kinds of visual rhetorics have. And so for me, locating my own voice, being able to start to tell my own story, helped me to own the fact that as an adopted person, that was an important aspect of my identity that I had denied for almost the first 40 years of my life, but it had a deep impact. And I needed to own that in order to be able to move forward as what I now consider myself, which is a scholar, artist, activist. I had to understand myself so that I could understand the way the world had impacted me, and the way that institutions and the culture of adoption had impacted me, so that I could move forward. Oh, that is the last slide, and that is not where I meant to go. Excuse me. Hang on one second. Now I got something else weird going on. Yay, technology. Okay, great. Back on track. So after locating my voice, the next step was being able to use my voice. And so a couple of things happened. The first of which was Unmothered, my solo show, Unmothered: A Story of Adoption and Patriarchy, which started as my dissertation project and has now evolved and is now an award-winning piece of solo performance that I use to shift dominant narratives about adoption, because it's an example of performance autoethnography. And my book, Adult Adoptees and Writing to Heal, came out of Unmothered as the first step, and then a pilot program that I ran with the Red Adoption Research Program. And what I learned in these two processes was that embodied storytelling names power. It centers marginal voices or quieted, silenced voices. And it sets this, and what it does is it sets the stage for resistance in higher education, because we can use embodied storytelling as educators to tell our own stories, to create relationships with our students, to forge bonds, and start to think about relationships instead of results, right? So that's one thing I want us to keep in mind, is the idea of relationships over results. We're here on this, at least I'm here on this earth, to be of service and to serve a purpose. And that purpose is to help people find their voices. And so that's central to my practice as a teacher, because I found that using my voice helped empower myself. And so when other people can find and use their voices, particularly our students or the people we're serving or working with, we're having more empowered people in the world. We're teaching more people to become the subject of their own stories and the authors of their own lives. And so Unmothered and my book led to now what is the Migrating Toward Wholeness process, which I will talk to you about a little bit later. A couple of texts, and I want to pause myself for a quick second and say that this presentation, because I did not say that at the beginning, this presentation is based off of an upcoming chapter in an anthology called Teaching Transnational Meanings, Methods, and Experiences. And my contribution is a chapter on autoethnography, and it's called Teaching Autoethnography and Teaching to Transgress Disrupting Colonial Paradigms in Higher Ed. And a couple of the texts that inform that particular work are Elizabeth Ettori's Autoethnography as Feminist Method, and of course, Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress. And it's, for me, the idea that autoethnography is an authentic method that refuses erasure is critically important. And that it's research that locates experience in the ebb and flow of emotional life. And it's this idea of locating ourselves in that space as well as educators is really important, because what happens is we can then, it allows our interpretations of personal truth to transform into narrative representations of political responsibility, right? The personal is political in this case. And we give ourselves permission to be the experts in our own lives and to put a mirror up to what's going on in culture, what's going on in society by way of our own story, right? And we get, like, I'm the expert in my own life, right? And nobody gets to tell me that my experience isn't my experience. And so if I can firmly situate myself in my own truth, my own internal truth, then I can start to speak that truth to power and start to disrupt the institutions that are harming me. And of course, these are the interlocking systems of oppression that we all need to work to dismantle. And my way of doing it is through this really authentic method of using autoethnography and personal storytelling to speak truth to power. Because what it helps me do, and what my contention is, and what I write about in this chapter, is that embracing autoethnography as both theory and praxis mends the split that denies the power of liberatory education for critical consciousness. And it's this idea of mending the split that's really appealing to me, that we all have the power in our classrooms, and in the spaces that we occupy to mend that split and allow for critical consciousness by engaging in the very human experience of storytelling. And that's where I come to my idea that more stories equal more connection, and more connection equals more healing. Because if we don't know one another's stories, then we don't know one another. And we can't, we create a bridge, an empathetic bridge, by knowing one another's stories. And so that's what autoethnography has helped me to do, and also how I see it as a decolonial practice, because it's personal and it speaks against all of the white supremacist and colonial and imperialist norms that want us to be disengaged and hierarchical in both our thinking and our practice. Which brings me to the concept of counterstory for knowledge production. So counterstory, and for me, counterstory and autoethnography really work side by side. They're parallel. They're really good companions, because counterstory or counter narrative, as Sharon Gare and Susan Maloney, who are two adoption researchers that I've cited a number of times in my own work, they talk about it as counter narratives or untellable stories, and I might talk a little bit more about that later. So this idea of untellable stories, particularly like in my example of being an adopted person, those are untellable stories because they're stories about trauma, they're stories about maternal separation, they're stories about things the public would rather not hear, but we have to tell those stories. And similarly, in Asia Martinez's counterstory, The Rhetoric and Writing of Critical Race Theory, it's a really impactful part of my teaching practice was bringing counterstory into my classroom, because it empowered my students whose identities were not white, were not cisgendered, were not male, were not the dominant norm. It empowered them to tell their own stories and disrupt the erasure that is already embedded in the majoritarian methods of teaching and learning, right? The teaching that they were getting in every other space. And I'll take a moment to just contextualize and say that that the chapter that I'm referencing in this presentation is based off of the 6 years that I spent teaching at a predominantly white institution in Utah, which is also a very conservative place. And so being able to show up as a feminist educator in a space that wasn't necessarily ready for someone like me, but needed someone like me, really galvanized my own methods and my own stance on a lot of things, including my real shift into radical feminism. And it also allowed me to like check a lot of my biases. And RAsheda talked beautifully about that yesterday, but it got me thinking about my own experience. And that's something that I've also attempted to do in this particular chapter, which is what is one of the important pieces of autoethnography as a method, is that it requires us to do the work of going inside and holding a mirror up to ourselves in order to look at all the bits and pieces and recognize where we need to shift, right? Where do I need to decolonize my own thinking? Where do I need to recognize and check my bias? And that takes me into also Mohanty's pedagogies of dissent, because the idea in her work that I have really pulled from is that this idea of dissent invites us to redistribute power and reclaim space as subjects. I'm pretty preoccupied with this shift from object to subject, and it's because my life began with a transaction. I was literally handed over. I had no agency in that situation. I did not choose that. Somebody chose that for me and then wrote a check. And so it has been the work of my life to reclaim my space as the subject of my own story, and then by extension, help other people to do the same. And for me, that is decolonization, recognizing that knowledge comes from lived experience, not the other way around. Okay, so really quickly, embodied pedagogy in action, what does it look like? It looks like bringing our whole selves into the classroom. Now, this is a vulnerability. This is a vulnerable thing to do. It takes a little bit of bravery, but for me, I can't imagine not showing up as my whole self, because I've worked really hard and spent a lot of money in therapy over the years to become integrated and whole and to become a more authentic version of myself. But I'll also tell you that autoethnography, as in theory and praxis, has helped me to locate the authenticity that I now show up with. So it works on a lot of levels, and that's the beautiful thing. But so if we're, as educators, the center of this ecosystem that we're creating in our classrooms and in the spaces that we're teaching in, and we show up as our whole selves, and then we surround that with activities like reflective resonance, which teaches people to listen, not to respond, which is how most of us are socialized and trained, right? Most of us listen to respond. Like, we're like, okay, what am I going to say in response then? But reflective resonance is actually active listening that invites us to have an empathetic exchange with the person who we're listening to, so that we're tapping into moments of resonance with what they're sharing with us. And we can say, oh yeah, me too. Or, I really felt it when you said. And practicing that on an ongoing basis when going through discussions in classroom spaces is a really powerful way of shifting power dynamics, of shifting who's taking up space in the room and who's not, and giving students an opportunity to practice effective communication skills. Other things like welcome rituals. I spent a good chunk at the beginning of this semester setting up and developing and cultivating a community space so that students get to know one another, get to know me. And that looks like disrupting the furniture, sitting in a circle. So that goes to their circle seating, right? Disrupting furniture, sitting in a circle, and going around and doing the name game. And so what the name game is I start and I say, hi, I'm Dr. Liz, and my favorite color is purple. And then the next person says, hi, I'm Chris. My favorite color is blue, and that's Dr. Liz, and her favorite color is purple. And we go around the circle. And of course, usually I was the last person, by the way. So then I would remember everybody's name, right? And we would do that every day until everybody knew everybody's name, because the quickest way to dehumanize a person is to not know their name or to mispronounce their name. And what happened in that process is that students would stop and say, wait a minute, can you tell me your name again? I want to get it right. And they would make sure that they got each other's names right, so that they were forming connections to one another from the very beginning. This brings me to some of the other things that are really important in my practice, and this is trauma-informed classroom practices. In 2008, Howard Bath wrote an article about the pillars of trauma-informed care, which are safety, connection, and managing emotions. And so one of the things that we, in my classroom that became really important was to use trauma-informed practices, because one of the things that I think a lot of educators miss is the fact that our students, just like we're carrying our own traumas from our own life experiences, whatever they might be, also epigenetic trauma, also intergenerational trauma, right? Our students are coming into our classrooms with traumas as well. And by pretending that they're not, we're doing them a disservice. And so for me, I needed to create an opportunity for students to feel safe. And so that looks like creating flexible structures that lower threat. So that meant flexible due dates, scaffolded tasks, complete and incomplete grading on low stakes assignments, so that they learned that we were valuing the process over the product, and then giving them really clear rubrics and opportunities to resubmit assignments when maybe they didn't get it as right as they wanted to. And what that did for students was it showed them that they had choices and that they could empower themselves to ask for what they needed. And there were students who, obviously were like, what do you mean I can turn that in again? But yeah, you can. If you're not happy with that grade because it's worth a grade, this particular assignment, and you want to do it again, here's the time frame, and please resubmit it. But use the feedback that I gave you, because feedback also, and that's something RAsheda talked about yesterday, was the importance of personal feedback and giving it to them sometimes in real time, or, in ways that are digestible, so that they understood that, like, I'm a real person reading your work, and I'm reading everything you work because I value what you have to say, and I value the exchange that we're having as teacher and student. And then what this, the feedback then also works to establish a connection, as does the rituals that build community, which, as I talked about in the last slide, the circle seating, the name circle introductions, also routine check-ins. I prioritized every semester one-on-one meetings a couple of times a semester, and it was built into the syllabus, into the course calendars, so that we would take a break from class time and students would make one-on-one appointments, and we would talk about their assignments that they were working on, because majority of what they were working on was personal narrative based. And so because one of the major shifts in my curriculum that I made was the shift to scholarly personal narrative, which was profound and very healing for a lot of students, and gave them some agency over what they were researching and why. And those routine check-ins helped them to build connections with me and to know that they had a person they could come to. And then the third piece of trauma-informed care is about managing emotions. And this is where the witnessing and reflective resonance comes into play. So assignments that are encouraging self-reflection, collective discussion of personal narratives. And those things come in the form of free writes, and then sharing sometimes those free writes, also sharing in their small groups when they're workshopping through particular parts of their scholarly personal narratives to figure out what story they're telling and why. We also used mini autoethnography assignments, one of which was called Where I'm From, which is from a George L. Lyon poem, who's an Appalachian poet. And the choice, and then there was a choice of that or What's My Playlist, so that students were given the opportunity to situate themselves geographically, socially, religiously, ethnically, etc., and see where they were, what their positionality was in on all of those ways, and establish an identity and look at where they were from or what their past, present, and future looked like through music, in order to start to create a deeper connection to themselves and their own stories and their histories, and then the opportunity to share that in community with the class helped to then continue to establish these connections, help them to engage with one another through personal storytelling and be witnesses and reflect back to one another what they were hearing and sharing. Okay, so this is the Migrating Toward Wholeness process wheel, and I have not been doing a real good job of paying attention to my time, but I think we are okay. And I, as I was putting this presentation together, it occurred to me that this is really the roadmap of resistance. And the reason I say that is because it, what it is a process. The process itself is a disruption of white supremacist norms, and it helps us to decolonize our thoughts, practices, and beliefs just by virtue of the fact that we're talking about making space to heal and rewriting the truth and expressing the wound, right? In the case of adoptees, it's the primal wound, but for most people, we can use the language core wound, or whatever the wound or the challenge or the hurt is, where we're expressing instead of repressing, right? Because white supremacy wants us to repress instead of express. And so this is the work of expressing and saying, no, I'm going to feel, I'm going to be a feeling, fully fledged human, and thereby become the subject of my own story by breaking the silences that have been a condition of my existence. And all of this put together is, really, because we know brains are plastic, it's about neuroplasticity, because when we engage in this process, we are shifting the neural networks in our brains, because we're shifting our internalized narratives and beliefs by rewriting them in a habitual way. And it also becomes a tool for both co and self-regulation. We can use writing to self-regulate. In fact, I will talk about that in a second. And then it's the idea of creating a safe environment, right? When we have a process within a framework within which to work, we're giving ourselves the opportunity to create safety and connection for ourselves. And so, just really quickly, the making space to heal portion of this process connects to both the emotional and the nervous system parts of trauma healing. And what these upend are the urgency and perfectionism of white supremacy, right? That worth equals pace and flawless output, right? That so again, that idea of we're rewarding the process rather than the product, right? We're slowing down the pace in order to engage in a process that is meaningful and connected and intentional. And so and the decolonizing classroom practice that is part of that is the flexible due dates, the scaffold tasks, the complete and incomplete grading, and that reduces anxiety and helps students to focus on their growth. The rewriting the truth portion of the process is the cognitive dimension of trauma healing, and that's about objectivity in the single story. So assignments like the scholarly personal narrative and the counterstory readings invited students to dismantle dominant narratives and begin to author their own analyses. Expressing the wound is the embodied part of trauma healing, and that upends the white supremacist norm of disembodiment and emotional suppression. And I also want to call in a little bit of Audre Lorde here, right? Because it's also tapping into the erotic, remembering that when we tap into that, which is the core of ourselves, the embodied, truthful knowing that we all have, the better able we are to connect to other people and to push back against white supremacist and colonial norms that want us to repress our feelings and repress our ability to think and be empathetic to other people's lives and situations. And so what this looks like in practice is grounding exercises before writing, sharing aloud that locates learning in what Elizabeth Ettori calls that embodied crossroads of words, flesh, and emotions. And then becoming the subject is the identity and integration piece, which pushes back against the hierarchy and binary identity boxes of white supremacy, right? The things that want to keep us small, the things that want to contain us. And this is something that another scholar who I've cited in the chapter, whose name is now escaping me, but I'll think of it later. She talks about the box self and how we can avoid the box self. And the box self is the self that like our authentic self, but we put it in a box and we put it on a shelf because we have to show up in spaces and fit somebody else's idea of us. And so it's remembering that when we show up fully authentic and integrated and whole, we can take that self out of the box and be that self. And so what that looks like in the classroom is collaborative syllabus. So at the beginning of the semester, another thing that was really important to my practice was having a collaborative syllabus review where we went through each part of the syllabus and had a community discussion, and students had the opportunity to ask questions, to brainstorm with one another, to suggest changes, to create a set of community norms and practices based on a set of suggestions that I gave them, where I said, like, these are my suggestions, but let's talk about them. Let's add or change things as we need to, because this is our space together. Giving students the opportunity to lead class at times, either through presentations or through teaching us something that they've learned from the research that they're doing. And then, of course, the identity work and writing that we did around where I'm from, and scholarly personal narrative explorations and the What's My Playlist assignments as some examples, letting them as learners move from object to subject. And then finally, we have this concept of breaking silences, which is a core component of this. And that's the relational piece of this. And it's also about nervous system co-regulation. And that pushes back against the fear of open conflict and politeness over truth, right? Because we're getting to our internal truths, and we're no longer being as polite as white supremacy wants us to be, and as the colonial, imperialist structures that are in place want us to be. And so that's where the reflective resonance circles and the breath work, right? So taking a pause in class, sometimes music is really helpful too, to help students get into their bodies and take a pause and take a breath. And we create space then, we can call it a brave space potentially, but for naming hardship, right? And co-regulating emotions, right? And it becomes a space where emotions are welcome, emotions are safe. And I will tell you that one of the beautiful things that of many that happened is one day I walked into my classroom and one of my students was hysterically crying. And there were three other students, young men who were in her small group, who had also gotten to class early, who had circled around her, and they were sitting with her and they were taking care of her, and they were getting her tissues, and one of them went and got her water, and they were talking her through whatever she needed to talk through. And I just came in and I observed and I checked in, but they had handled the situation because that community of care was already in place, right? We had done that work, and it mattered to them that she walked in upset, and we weren't going to do anything until everybody was okay. And so a little bit of further proof here of what the student outcomes and voices were. And these were a lot of responses, some during COVID and just post-COVID, which y'all, we know it was a time. You can see here that each of these particular comments corresponds to each of the different parts of the migrating toward wholeness process, as well as the parts of trauma healing that, then trauma-informed care that are embedded here, which is what developed as I started collecting student feedback and started engaging in these practices. I began to see that this was all interconnected. And so, the student who wrote about class making them extremely woke, and I love his use of the term woke, like in a positive way, right? Because like that's also, reclaiming language and using it in a way that's more generative, shall we say. But this is the cognitive and habitual dimension of rewriting the truth. And what I want to highlight here is that the student emphasizes a mental awakening, right? That he's become extremely woke. And this is having a new habit of questioning previously held assumptions. And so this is an active example of a student who is reevaluating their worldview and their personal identity, wondering how he can become a better person. And this is exactly the kind of cognitive work that the migrating toward wholeness process targets in this particular part of the process, interrogating dominant narratives and constructing a more authentic and self-authored truth. The student who wrote about the breaking silence's relational piece of the healing process here, about having the first semester online being really difficult, and she talked about support systems and feelings. And what this example shows is that there's a shared vulnerability here that is developed. The student is acknowledging that there was hardship, and how openly naming the struggles, breaking the silence around them, became possible because of the class. Also, there's a nod here to community care. They attribute this particular student is attributing resilience to support systems like this class and highlighting the collective bonds that form when silences are broken. So what I said earlier, when we start to become human and share our stories and get to know one another in those ways, we become a support system. We become a community of care. And of course, there's a deep emotional imprint here, because their lasting memory of the class is the feelings that they experienced. And this signals that the relational co-regulating exchanges, which are core to this relational dimension of trauma healing, left a really deep impact on the students. Okay, so now's my time to close before we move into the discussion and questions, which is awesome. I want to call in Gloria Anzaldúa here. We are each our sisters and brothers keepers, and it is the responsibility of some of us who tap the vast source of spiritual and political energies to help heal others and to put down a drawbridge. So that's my reminder of our collective responsibility as educators, as educators who are holding space for healing and truth, that we help to that we consider ourselves the drawbridge, how to create that bridge for our students and the people and the communities that we serve. I want to remind you that autoethnography is an active demonstration of the personal is political. And that challenges to neoliberalism, suggests new questions for feminist epistemology, and point toward necessary conceptualizations of resistance, community, and agency. And I really want to highlight resistance, community, and agency here. And that when our lived experience of theorizing is fundamentally linked to the processes of self-recovery and collective liberation, that no gap exists between theory and practice. And so that's the other part here that I want everyone to remember to take away, is there's no gap between theory and practice when we are looking at collective liberation, by honoring personal truth, by showing up as our authentic selves, and by remembering that our students are full, whole people as well. And so as I close this out today and shift into the conversation, I want to ask you all to consider what is one embodied narrative-driven practice that you will commit to this week, this month, this year, to keep building connections and make more space for healing. Because more stories equal more connection, and more connection equals more healing. And I'd love you to stay connected.
That was fantastic. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to diving in and talking a little bit more about some of the things that you brought up. I think a great place to start is to, take a step back and make sure that everybody here is on the same plane. For instance, I think I sent you over a message. I think you were talking about Angela Gilmore, and as
Yes,
that,
thank you.
yeah, as that scholar. And now that we named her in that, I love to just make sure that we've got some good information here. Autoethnography.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little what is autoethnography, and why is this such an important research option, especially considering feminist thought and practice?
Yeah. So as I talked about, for me, autoethnography is the thing that, you know, cracked open the last 10 years of my life, right? That has helped me build this incredible body of work that has not only been helpful to me, but has been really helpful to many other people, and frankly has been life giving and life changing. But for me, um, I think of autoethnography as a really important practice and process, both as a research method and a teaching method, because it creates space for empathetic exchange, because it's fluid and it's engaged with both the self and another's humanity, and it asks us to be an insider and an outsider, right? Again, that idea of the living embodied crosswords of words, flesh, interpretations, and humanity. So who am I in the world? How is the world impacting me, right? What are the systems that are impacting me? And so, like, in theory, if autoethnography asks us to locate research in the ebb and flow of emotional life, then as a pedagogy, it's about locating ourselves in that same ebb and flow, and therefore we're creating space for not only our own humanity but the humanity of our students, right, by inhabiting our full selves. And so for me, autoethnography, and why is it still so hard to say?
It's a hard
Really,
to say word.
really means embracing the invitation to be emotional and reflexive and think critically about my position in the world, and
Mhm.
not, instead of cutting myself off, right? Instead of cutting myself off and shutting myself down, which, by the way, trauma does to people. And so does white supremacy and colonial capitalist thinking.
Okay. That works perfectly. I really think that's a good lead into a couple other things I wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page about. Positionality is so important in these discussions. Can you just make sure everybody has a working understanding of what that is?
Yeah. So, positionality is who am I? How do I show up in the world? How do other people perceive me? Like, where do I come from socially, geographically, educationally, right? It can include my intersections of my identities. And so for me, I'm a white cisgender middle-aged woman who also happens to be adopted. And the adoptee part of my identity is an invisible intersection of my identity, but it informs my positionality and it informs the stance that I take in the world. So, like, I also think of positionality as like literally, where do I stand? Right.
Okay. I like I like that, and it was something that Professor Young and I talked about yesterday. Getting into is where you stand in the world, how the world sees you, the privileges and power that
Hmm.
you either have or you don't have from systems of oppression. And
Yes.
what's your place in all that? Are you getting into some research that I like to read? Are you complacent in in those systems? Are you taking full advantage of it and jumping into it? So I think that's really cool. Whiteness, because you've mentioned yourself as a white person, but that's a little different from whiteness, right?
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. It's because yeah, it is different. Like,
A little
yeah,
bit.
I'm a white person, but like, do I identify with whiteness? Probably not. But I have a, but again, my positionality is very different because of my education, because of the the sheer need to understand why things are the way they are, right? Because I see systems of oppression, and I want to dismantle them, right? Because I see the way that those systems are disadvantageous to so many people. And so like, so the difference between whiteness and being a white person, like some people identify with whiteness, like, and I would say that like that's a connection to white supremacy, right? That folks who are identifying with whiteness are doing so because they feel like there's a particular privilege or a superior stance attached to that, which for me, I'm on the other side of that. I see it as deeply problematic.
Okay. And and that's really important to discuss your positionality, not just looking at, literally how you appear to the world, but also the education, the training, the efforts you've taken to say, okay, I'm aware of how I'm feeling, how I look, and what I'm walking into this with, but this is what I'm trying to do to counteract some of that. And I really think that's important in understanding our place in hegemony. One of the questions that a participant brought up kind of spoke to hegemonic narratives, hegemony. I think it's a good idea to, jump into that really quickly because I think it works with some of the stuff that we're talking about. Their question was, what tools do you use to help students critically analyze the narratives of their lives rather than tell their lives by relying on hegemonic narratives, such as the predictable life was hard, but I work hard and pulled myself through? What tools do you help them to critically analyze the narratives in your lives? And I think this would be a good way to lean into some of the reflexive stuff you were talking about in your very recent chapter.
Mhm. Yeah. So one of the primary tools is, as I said, starting with these mini autoethnographies, right? So like, because we have to break down some of these dominant narratives, and like the myth of meritocracy, right? Like, oh, my life is hard, but if I work hard, it's going to be fine. Right? We sometimes, so one of the tools is looking at particular pervasive myths that are showing up in students' lives. Um, what are some of the beliefs that they have been told because of where they're from, how they were raised? And so the where I'm from assignment brings up these questions. It allows us to get into the critical questioning of people's individual stories via their positionality. So like if we're using the template of the poem, it asks them to like talk about the literal places that they're from, but also the metaphorical and spiritual and other places. And so then they're starting to tell stories about the families they were raised in, the communities they come from, some of the discourse communities that they're a part of, because in a writing classroom we talk about discourse communities, and we can start to question what are some of the beliefs that have come out of that for you, and how, and so when they start to develop that into a longer personal narrative, they can focus on one aspect of their story that feels interesting, that holds up a mirror to something that they have a question about.
Got it.
So that's one example.
Okay. And I really think that's speaking. I love the practice, by the way. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Liz.
I just thought of one other thing that I wanted
Go for
to
no,
to
go ahead.
throw
Go ahead.
to throw out there as another tool. Another tool is engaging with other people's stories. So one of the things that I found really impactful, was assigning an independent reading list. And so students each semester were given a list of 10 or 12 different memoirs to choose from, and the only criteria was that they had to choose somebody's story who was different from them, someone who did not share the same identity as them. um, and then they could choose anything that happened to be on the list that semester. And we, and so like, if you, as a white woman, like I wasn't going to pick a story written by a white woman. I also intentionally curated that list to avoid overlap in identity. But there was, and students would, a couple times, I had Life's Work by Dr. Willie Parker on there. And students, and I didn't say anything. I just said, here's the list, read through the descriptions. And students would choose that book and they would read that book. And I would say, why did you choose this book? Well, it's because this is something I don't know a lot about abortion, and I wanted to educate myself, and it seemed like a good way to do that. And now I really think about it differently. Yeah.
Kind of speaks to the necessity of having a strong array of books on diverse topics.
Yeah.
Perhaps we should pass this information along to some higher ups. So, question. You it seems like you were leaning into, and like I said, what I love about this activity is it's asking the students, tell me who you are, tell me where
Hmm.
you came from, and having them put that in writing. And then we can use that as a tool for exposure. Like, hey, this is what you're coming from. And
Yeah.
now let's look at the lives of someone else
Yeah.
and see where we different. I really think that helps with establishing some critical consciousness. Can you
Yes.
talk about some critical consciousness there?
Yeah, it absolutely does, for sure. I mean, and that's, I think for me, that's so important, is giving people, the students, the opportunity to have some critical consciousness. And again, like a lot of these practices came out of being in a very um, homogeneous society. When I lived in Utah, um, there's a very dominant Latter-day Saint church culture, and people are born into those communities and into that religion, and it's very insular in that way, and there's not a lot of diversity of thought because of that. um and so me as an outsider stepping into that space with a completely different worldview in a lot of ways, um was I got really interested in, like, how do I begin to create space for more critical consciousness among these students who really were hungry for it, who were like, oh, okay, because they were making connections to their own internal experiences and being able to start to articulate some of the things that they had been thinking about but didn't have language for, because they were connecting to other people's stories, and they were connecting to one another's stories. Because the other thing that is important, that was important as part of the Where I'm From process and the community building process of that assignment, was that students were invited, and it was always an invitation, not an obligation, to present and share. And they had they could choose how they wanted to do that. They could stand up in class and they could read their poem, and then engage in Q&A with the rest of, and discussion with the rest of the class. They could make a video and show the video, or post it on in our online discussion forum. They could choose, they could do a PowerPoint, so they had lots of options
Okay.
um, for how to present that. But then what those student presentations did was it opened up community discussion around people's identities and experiences. And so, like, students would share pictures of their lives as part of this, right? One of the uh, a criteria for the assignment was that they were welcome to make a PowerPoint and include pictures. And by the way, I always did this myself first, and I would share where I'm from with them, and I would give them my PowerPoint, and I would say, this is where I'm from, this is who I am, and model for them, so that they got to know me and where I came from, which was very different. And they could say, oh, like, you rode the Staten Island ferry every day? What's that like? Right? Or tell me
I
about this cheese that you have in this picture, right? Like my favorite grated cheese, right? And then it opens up discussions around family culture and history and food, and the things that make us human, but also the different, you know, like details of our stories that help us to get curious.
I like that. I really think I think that's so important because you're not just talking about critical consciousness like hey, I'm aware of my privilege and I'm good. No, it's an active practice that continues. It's not a destination. It's more
Yeah.
of a journey, to use that. And now I've got a little bit of a challenging question here. This one comes from one of the participants.
Uh-huh.
Um, I might be able to add some help with responding to it, but got to lean on you as the expert on this. Persons can curious about how to scale up some of this work in a non-writing situation. How do I, they work with first year required students in an all masters public health program, so about 150 students plus.
Uh-huh.
So, related to that, many of them undergrad during COVID, seem to get strong pushback for some of our attempts to bring in personal reflection, positionality. They see it as fluff, which I definitely ran into before.
Hmm.
So, how could they go about one facilitating to such a large group and then getting into, uh, you know, how to speak to this not being fluff? And I'm gonna have one of your papers dropped into the comments here because I think it makes a good reference. But can you give some insight into this one?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's one of the reasons that I am so deeply invested in autoethnography, personal narrative, and like even trauma writing in particular as a way of pushing back. Because yeah, so like it is, so we think about the left brain, the sort of two, like left brain, right brain, the two sides of the canon. And in the like in the canon in general, right, the academic canon will say like we are privileging like thought and reasoning, and we're not privileging the feeling and emotion side of things, except that those two things have to work together. And so if students don't know how they feel, they're not going to be able to think very well. So I think my main piece of advice for starting to work with some of this kind of material in a larger class, because it can be challenging with 150 students, right? Like
Yeah.
you want student reflections, but they can be brief student reflections. You can also give them free writing assignments, ask them to free write for 2 or 3 minutes about a particular topic, or about where they come from, or about a belief that they have about the subject matter. And I'm just gonna like throw something out there, like what was the program that this person's teaching in again?
I think it was a health program, a
A
public
health.
health program.
Okay, so public health, right? So I mean, there's so much tied to that, right? Like I could tell you that like mental health in the adoption community is a public health crisis, right? So like doing like think from your own perspective, and a place of from your particular the identities that you hold. What are your beliefs about health and public health? What does public health mean to you? Right? So getting them to personally reflect on the subject matter from the location of their identity as a way into the rest of the material could be really useful.
Okay. I think that is very useful, and I think one of the things that you were bringing up is kind of pointing to the validity, the need to understand who you are as a person, how it affects your lens.
Yeah.
There was a scholar who uh, who who really worked to make sure that illustrations in medical journals also included folks who weren't all white. Many of the illustrations just included folks who were white. Now, the issues with that is a bruise on my skin looks very different than a bruise on your skin. And then a bruise
Yes.
is used as a diagnostic tool to say, okay, this person has this particular ailment, then this is something that's really important to consider. And if your lens is not been challenged, you're only focused in on, whiteness, in this particular case, skin color, even whiteness broadly, as the standard, you often don't think about that. Someone
Yeah.
brought up measles and things of that sort. Um, what does this look like? So, especially when something of public health, it's good to know who you are as a person and how that lens affects how you practice medicine.
Right. There's also a really great text by Louis Meal Madrona. Um, called, I'm going to have to check because it is not coming to my middle-aged brain. Um,
I'm pulling it up.
I'm getting it. I'm getting it.
But go ahead and make your point. I think we'll be able to put it into the chat here.
Narrative medicine.
Yes.
It's called narrative medicine. And reading some of his work as an indigenous um, doctor, of psychiatric medicine has been really impactful in mine. In that, that's a great resource for us to think about the ways that narrative is important, even in the sciences. Um,
Yeah, I think you're right on that. Um, and I'll put this in the chat for everyone. I was able to pull up his piece here. Spending a little bit more time with this question, because I think we've kind of talked about, all right, this is why it is important for you to engage into some introspective looking, some
mhm.
moving towards critical consciousness or reflexivity. Doing it in such a big crowd. I mean, a lot of the writing stuff that might be difficult for 150 people. And I remember in student affairs when we were working to try to get a large group to actually start to think about who they are as individuals, what privileges, what powers they come into
Yeah.
place. I mean, do you know any of those activities? I have a few, but
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, just we have the ability to like use those little quiz apps and like
oh
have,
yeah, yeah,
have people answer a question or respond, to a prompt, and it will populate onto a screen. And then the word, like when there are
yeah,
overlaps, when, so if you have 150 students and you're asking them a particular to reflect, to do like a bit of reflection and, introspection about a question or a topic, and then it's populating on the screen, you're going to get like the words or phrases that are being repeated by multiple people in the room are going to get bigger and more prominent in that word cloud, for example, and that's going to tell you something, right? That's useful data, because then if, like, I don't know, the most, like, I'll just use an adoptee example, like one of the words that comes up frequently when I do activities like that in adoptee circles is the concept of enoughness, right?
yes.
And so, like, if that's the thing that most people are identifying in that particular conversation, then we can unpack that, right? That gives us somewhere to go.
I like that. I I always forget about those little clickers.
Mhm.
When I was an administrator in student affairs, technology wasn't always available, so we had very hands-on things that all
Yeah,
need to be facilitated. I think that's very important because a lot of these activities, you'll jump out there and you'll open up some wounds, you'll start some
yeah,
conversations.
yeah. No, that I mean, and that's why it was really critical for me to explain the importance of trauma informed care, right? Those three pillars, because if you don't already have those in place, you're not giving students or people like you're not creating a good environment for them to delve into things, right? Like,
Yes,
and so they have to feel safe to do that. And then they also have to know that it's a choice to do
yes.
that. And we're not asking people to, like, tell their deepest, darkest secrets, but we're asking them to think critically about the pieces of their experience that might benefit from interrogation.
Mm,
Right. And
I
so
like
even
that.
just asking like bigger, more open-ended questions like that, like what are the parts of your experience that might be worth interrogating, and
Got
why,
it.
as they relate to, and insert whatever your subject matter is, whatever the topic of the class is. um and you can ask like you can also ask students to do personal reflections um as part of their meta cognitive practices. That's just for them. And then you can use that if you happen to have one-on-one sessions with students or meeting with students, you can ask them like, hey, have you been using your reflection journal, and what is that bringing up for you in terms of the coursework, So I think that's another really useful tool when we're thinking about how to use these sort of narrative approaches to help students grow and succeed, is to give them an ability to use it as a metacognitive practice.
Hmm. I guess I gotta point to something, name it a bit. You know, we research this, write on it, publish on it, so we can go through and dance and talk about a lot of these big. Some of the stuff can be a little intimidating. I guess I always want to remind people, if you're working on college, university, there's a bunch of resources that are usually available to you. Ones that I used all the time. I used my counseling, and
Mhm.
counseling caps was always fantastic for having someone come in and just, because you open something up, you don't always know what you're going to open up there. There's usually great resources for doing programs and things like that. I love working with student affairs folks because they're used to working with large amounts of individuals to get some of this stuff done. Are there any other resources that you might suggest to anyone listening?
Um, I think anything, I would say, like, if you're interested in incorporating any of these practices, do them yourself first, right?
Oh, I
Like,
like that.
make yourself, like, it's the practice of autoethnography, right? Like I couldn't have done anything that I've done if I hadn't first made myself the subject of my own research, right? If I hadn't looked at myself and looked at my story and gone, okay, what's there? What's
Uh,
there? Right? And then engaged in these practices myself to understand how they felt, what they meant, and how they might translate. And so always do the practice yourself, like do as I do, not as I
mm,
say. Right. And I think that's another way of decolonizing our practices and our thinking, right? Because we've got, so many traditions of teaching where people are asking students to do things that they have never done themselves, or that they have no intention of doing themselves.
you know, I think that's a great way of pulling back into some of your writing about autoethnography. I did get a chance to look through, I'm not gonna say I read the 30 pages, but I did get a chance of looking through your recent book chapter, Autoethnography, Authenticity, and Teaching to Transgress, Resisting Colonial Paradigms in Higher Education. And I really thought there was some great stuff in there. And it comes back to autoethnography as a tool, which admittedly is something that's more of a one-to-one. This is where the work lives here. But you talk about it in the context of feminist theory, and I kind of wanted to get into the weeds on that a bit.
Yeah.
How do you center feminist thought in your work, and why is autoethnography such an important and unique research option for feminist thought?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't not center feminist thought in my work, like, because it's who I am, right? It's not like, it's like I'm a feminist every day. Like it's a choice, right? As like Bell Hooks said, right? It's a lifestyle, right? It's not like like it's not like it's people who are just Christian on Sunday, but not the rest of the week, right? Like that's not what feminism is about for me. It's about living into a particular set of values and looking through a particular lens at the world, which is not always a kind place to women, to anyone who is othered. And so, like, that's actually like the rhetorical construction of my show, on dash capital M dash capital othered, is about that many of us are othered in this society. And so that's how feminism shows up in the language that I use, in the intentional way that I approach everything that I do, because I value authenticity, I value um, transparency, I value honesty, and I value diversity in all of its forms. And that includes, like, my, picking apart my own biases. And so when I think about autoethnography as a feminist method, it's a method that is feminist because it and we just said, right, like there's a deprivileging of autoethnography as a viable research method, right? There's a lot of people that want to be like, oh, but that's not real research.
Yeah. Yeah, they
right?
do get a
And
little
you and
tough.
I have had these conversations multiple times, right? And I have these conversations a lot, where there's like, oh, but it's not no, actually it is. It is because it is for feminists, because when you are looking at the world as I do, as a series of interlocking systems of oppression, right? Like patriarchy and white supremacy and and I I have to look at how those things have affected my life, right? And those things affect my life differently, of course, as a white person, but as an adopted person, right? There's a whole other layer there. And and if I don't, let me stop myself for a second because I'm getting heated. Um, if
You
I
got heated
don't
yesterday. It's good.
look at the way that these systems are impacting me, then I'm not going to understand how they're impacting other people. And so autoethnography as a feminist method allows me to use the personal experience that I have, the lived experience that is my expertise, that nobody gets to tell me is not mine, and hold a mirror up to the bigger social and cultural institutions that are causing harm. And it is in that way that it is an authentic method, and it is a real research method because it's teaching us how to dismantle those systems of oppression by looking at them, by understanding the ways that they're causing harm, and by telling different stories about them.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons that, and I completely understand it. A lot of people qualify research one particular way, transferability. If I hear that 90% of people did X, I want to be able to say, ooh, how does that apply to the population as a whole? And what this type of research really does, I'll let you speak about this one. From my understanding, it's more of if the shoe fits, wear it. It's more of here are the experiences that someone is going through. How does this
Mm.
apply to your life? And ask that person to do that bit of work themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean that's the other part of it, right? Is that like when we talk about reflexivity and critical consciousness, right? It helps, from a research perspective. There's a huge amount of reflexivity in being able to do the work as an autoethnographer, right? To tell the stories, to hold those mirrors up against, up to culture and the systems that are harming people. But then, you know, ha- putting it out there for other people to engage with and giving them the opportunity to develop their own critical
Right.
consciousness is what autoethnography as a research method does. And that's super important because, as I said, like the students that were engaging with other people's stories were developing critical consciousness that about not only their own lives but about the way the world was affecting other people, and about the ideas that maybe that they had thought were true because of the way that they were raised, and the stories they were told about particular uh, choices or decisions that other people made, right? The example of the student who said, like, this class helped me be more woke, and now I want to figure out how to be a better person, right? And it's the same thing. So like I'll use myself as the example. So Unmothered, like as a piece of performance autoethnography, was intentionally, I intentionally created that in order to open up a conversation around a really difficult subject. People do not want to talk about the trauma of adoption and maternal separation. They want to believe the rainbows and unicorns version of that narrative, except that when you sit in an audience and there's an empathetic exchange between me as the performer slash storyteller and you as the audience member, like fiction, going to theater helps people develop empathy, and so that autoethnographic performance helped people to understand adoption from a different perspective,
Gotcha.
right? And so it's about perspective shift from through, from through an empathetic exchange, and I think, like, I would say my superpower is empathy, you know,
Mm.
um, and more of us need that. And so when I also am having this, conversation writ large about decolonizing thinking and decolonizing practices, that is exactly why we need research that is based in autoethnography, because we need more people's stories. We need more qualitative evidence.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I guess I have well, a few more questions, but I'll ask this one question and then give you an opportunity to sum up and pull everything back together because you've mentioned Audre Lorde, you've mentioned bell hooks, and you've challenged the perspective of white feminism in your writing. And talk a little bit about the differences between white feminism, liberal feminism, and how you
Yeah.
now see yourself as a radical feminist.
Yeah, I mean, and so again, this is one of the interesting things that autoethnography challenges us to do, is to examine our own biases and our own interpretations of things. And
Hmm.
so very much when I showed up to Utah, and I even used to say to my students, I am a liberal feminist from New York, right? Because that was true at the time. And then the more I studied and I got into grad school and I started reading all of this, Black feminism, because I went to a very progressive grad school that it was like deeply rooted in social justice and engaging difference. And I was like, oh, this, this is where it's at, because I suddenly understood that the thinking that I had wasn't as progressive as I believed it to be. And so, like, at this point, I was thinking about this morning. Like, there's a lot that white feminism has gotten wrong, you know,
Ooh, yes.
and and I and I think it was a moment in time, but and it was useful, like second wave, like useful in some ways, right? But is it really empowering anybody? No. It's like, so the thing for me is that what white feminism, especially, like, the difference between liberal and radical feminism, is that liberal feminism is not empowered feminism. It's not a feminism that is empowering anyone to actually live into any values or dismantle any systems of oppression. Whereas radical feminism invites us to show up in authentic and empowered ways and build solidarity. And, like, if all of us are free, none of us are free. And then there's a whole lot of white feminists that don't get that.
I I I
and
love
there's
that
still
breakdown.
I got one more thing to say about
Go
that.
for
They're
it. Go for it.
still using the master's tools. And that's the problem.
You had to sneak in Audre Lorde in there.
I did, because I was
All
like, that's
right.
the other important thing I need to say about this, and how why, what my definition of this is for myself, right?
I love that. And it's really important to, I mean, you could have gotten to the history of liberal feminism working within. I mean, it really points to the power and privilege that came with white feminism because they were able to work within the system and get the power that came from that. It was just shifted a little bit over here. Whereas if you're looking at the voices of Black feminist writers, and they're going, hey, we can't do this. We're not at the table. It's not a matter of just belly up or pull up a chair. We gotta do some stuff. So yeah, it's more of a inkling to flip the table over than try to pull up a chair to it.
Yeah, because the table's got a broken leg, you know, so we got to build a new table.
All right. I No, no, I think that's great. We've had some fun conversations about feminism. and the different perspectives. And I love to see you know, coming out and say, hey, you know, I'm more of a radical feminist right now. I'm looking at these systems don't seem to be working for everybody. What can we do about that? If you can
Yeah,
give folks a little bit, because I'm gonna give you after this one, I'm gonna give you all the stage to shut it down and give us a rundown of everything you covered. But if somebody wants to learn about Black feminist thought, womanism. They want to learn about some of the things that you mentioned today and why you made that move. Can you give them some readings other than yours, because we already posted yours in the chat. Some things
yeah,
that folks should read.
yeah. I mean, I'm one of my all-time faves, Sister Outsider.
Okay.
You know, just just a collection of essays by Audre Lorde. Um, really powerful stuff, and you know, can be done in short chunks. Anything by Bell Hooks, but like you
Anything.
know, anything really.
Anything.
But like if you're interested in teaching, you know, teaching to transgress, if you're interested in her, you know, like thinking about love as an action, you know, all about love. And there's a whole series there. Also feminism from margin to center, um, was really impactful in my own learning. Also, I gotta give some props to Patricia Hill Collins, um, you know, for teaching, you know, for teaching me about positionality and standpoint theory, right? Like because like that is as an adopted person, I got that. I was like,
Hmm.
oh, okay. You know, and so really so much and I'm gonna throw out I mean real Angela Davis obviously, um you know, women, race, class, and power.
Okay.
And I'm gonna throw out Undrowned
Okay.
by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, which is a
Okay.
really interesting and beautiful text. And I recently did like did a presentation on her concept of undrowning, um, as it relates to adoptees and adoptee writing, because it felt really like salient to me. This idea of like, how do we become undrowned when all these forces are working against us, right? And our bodies and our minds and our, you know, ancestry has been colonized and capitalized on. And this all resonates for me because, like, as I said, my life began with a transaction, and I have had to do a significant amount of work to feel like a whole, real, full person.
You know what? I think that's a perfect place to end it. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate the reading list at the very end. Um, I I love using a will to change. I use it in my writing and my presentations all the time. And you brought up some other stuff that I got to dig into. So thank you so much for teaching me. I appreciate that. Um, Dr. Liz DeBetta, this has been fantastic. Thank you for presenting today and teaching at the intersections, autoethnography, linguistic justice, and racial belonging. Um, and thank you all for joining us. There'll be a survey at the end of this webinar. Help us to continuously improve. We invite you to complete that. And thank you for participating in this event. Until next time.
Thank you so much. It's been great
Thank
to
you,
be here.
Liz.